So let's talk a bit about wokeness in media, specifically forced diversity. Let me lead this off by talking about Space Marine 2. Space Marine 2 is a multiplayer mode called Operations. In said game mode, you're allowed to choose from a variety of classes to play as, and each of these classes boasts its own abilities that fit within several different situations in the game. Furthermore, you can arm your Marines with many long-range weapons, mid-range weapons, or melee weapons. But ultimately, each class is set apart from one another in both abilities and weapons, and so an appropriate descriptor would be to say that the classes are diverse. But note here that in my saying that they are diverse, all I've done is make a factually true statement. I have not applied any degree of moral value to the word. Instead, I've only used the word as it would literally apply to the subject matter. Now from here, you could argue for a setup in the game that would best handle certain situations. For example, maybe you want to get a bulwark class to tank things at close quarters, and then you get a sniper class to shoot things from afar. And then you add a tactical class to provide mid-range support. By talking about this dynamic, I could make a case that diversity is a good thing. But here, it would only be good in the sense that diversification provides this team with advantages throughout an operation. So this is only pragmatically expedient. None of this means that diversification is morally expedient. And that's where we start to draw a line between what is and is not woke when it comes to diversity. You see, on most occasions when we hear people talk about diversity in anything, what you hear about is something that is being forced, and it's all superficial. But despite that, it is mandated in terms of morality. Now, one of the main problems with this is that woke diversity versus practical diversity implies that our physical attributes, our skin color, our sex, our facial features, our size, all of it has some kind of moral value. And so there we ask the question, where does this moral value originate? Well, it's all derived from this applied marginalized or victim status. Because we live in this post-Christian state right now, remnants of our religious beliefs compel the strong to protect the weak. In addition, we must be charitable to the poor, and we are also compelled to treat each other fairly and equally.
The evil assumption that all Negroes lie, all Negroes are basically immoral beings, all Negro men are not to be trusted around our women. An assumption that one associates with minds of their caliber. And which is in itself, gentlemen, a lie.
But I've stated in previous videos that these Christian morals have been misaligned, they've been twisted. There are bad actors who have taken advantage of goodwill, and so many people will lay claim to a marginalized or victim status, simply as a means of procuring unearned power for themselves. And this is of course what we will acknowledge as wokeness, the recognition that certain people are being given power, not through a merit-based system, but by virtue of simply existing within an identity. And unfortunately at this point, much of that wokeness is now being actively mandated through DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, where does DEI get its power from? Well, frankly, DEI is part of a myriad of top-down regulation of behavior that mimics a state-mandated mission to remove any and all bias from society.
Aaron McIntyre and the guys from the Good Old Boys podcast suggest that we're now living in a fifth republic, the civil rights regime. The strong man behind this republic was LBJ. The first person I heard criticize the Civil Rights Act was Rand Paul. Then I saw Pastor Doug Wilson echoing those criticisms. But until I read Christopher Caldwell's book, The Age of Entitlement, I didn't realize how much it had transformed the country. Caldwell argues that they had inadvertently voted themselves a second constitution without explicitly repealing the one they had. Each constitution contained guarantees. But the Civil Rights Act made it the job of the government to root out inequality, which means rooting out bias. What we call political correctness is the natural outcome of civil rights, which makes fighting bias a condition for the legitimacy of the state. Once bias is held to be part of the unconscious of human nature, there are no areas of human life in which the state's vigilance is not called for.
And that is the key thing there. Once bias is held to be part of the unconscious of human nature, there really are no areas of human life in which the state's vigilance is not called for. So DEI as a discipline wants you to accept two things. Number one, that somehow individual people represent an entire group of people rather than just their individual selves. And what that implies is that any interactions you have with said individual will be judged as if you are regarding an entire group, and that will include both positive and negative interactions. In other words, DEI actually mandates racism. And number two, accepting that DEI is even necessary in the first place is a subliminal acknowledgement that you are a bigot with your own subconscious bias. That means if anybody accuses you of being one of the isms, you have no recourse, since you voluntarily put yourself under the thumb of DEI. So you can't deny anything because you acknowledge that you are capable of bigotry subconsciously. Now, will there ever be a point where DEI serves its purpose and removes any and all bias? No. Never. Bias must necessarily always be present. Otherwise, the Civil Rights Act, which Wade was talking about, has no purpose, and the state itself will have no purpose. DEI must always have an enemy, and that enemy is white people. Specifically anyone of European descent, but more appropriately those who have adopted traditional values originating from Western Europe. And yes, this means even people with non-white skin, if they too wish to moor themselves in Western European cultural values, can and will be attributed as white people, as they will also be seen as perpetuating so-called white racism and bigotry. Now, what this means is that if you really think you can just fall back on whatever it is that makes you marginalized, be it your skin color, your sex, or whatever, think again. This is all ideological. Your marginalized status will not be enough to save you. You must necessarily become a true believer. And white people will never be allowed to not be racist. Because if the situation was made as easy as that, then the state would have nothing to fight, and therefore would not be able to maintain its power. And this is why it's become appropriate to associate the use of the term diversity with non-white. You see, if we were going strictly by the definitions of words themselves, then yes, of course, diversity would include all races, even white people. But ever since the Civil Rights Act, white people have and will remain antithetical to this unrealized, unbiased utopia. And now you realize why it makes perfect sense, for example, for why someone like Synthetic Man would watch a show like Amazon's Fallout and notice that the daughter of one of the main characters is of a mixed race.
And I find this even more funny because his kid is mixed race. So his black wife divorced him, and now he plays fucking birthday parties. How black-pilling is that? And at the risk of getting a shit ton of dislikes from normies, just like my review of the first episode of The Last of Us, I find this even more funny because if you know anything about marriage statistics, you would know that white male, black female actually has the lowest divorce rates. So in a way, you could almost say this is anti-propaganda, but I still think it's promoting race mixing, as basically every show on television does.
And essentially, we all really know this because many of us have been repeatedly told that this is what's happening. It's either outright or subliminal, but we're constantly being told that white people should not exist.
An unrelenting stream of immigration. Non-stop. Non-stop. Folks like me who were Caucasian of European descent, for the first time in 2017, will be in an absolute minority in the United States of America. Absolute minority. Fewer than 50% of the people in America, from then and on, will be white European stock. That's not a bad thing. That's a source of our strength.
So of course we don't recognize this because of some irrational hatred towards marginalized people. We recognize it because more or less we have been told to recognize it.
And for those of you who don't know, Jacob is a black man, he's a Marine, and he's your first kind of like point of contact. So your first interaction with him, you're like crouching behind cover and you're having like a close quarters conversation. And when this happened in the game, it was this really powerful and remarkable moment for me, because it was two black characters talking one-on-one, and neither of them is cast as a criminal, they're not a sidekick, they're not a savage, they're not a stereotype, they're not a gang member. And they're the only two people on screen in this moment talking about something much greater than them. And it was just like really, really, really nice. And I think that in our industry and in so many creative industries, if you want to look at film and television and any art form, we start treating our core demographics as a fixed and static value, something that does not want to change and something that is locked in place. So despite like the changing face of audiences, despite the changing face of conferences like this one, we still look at our core demographics and say, okay, they're white, cis, hetero males. I think we need to step out of this rule that like white men can enjoy fantasy worlds, aliens, sci-fi, monsters, anything, so long as it's through a lens that looks exactly like them.
Well, behaviors are going to have to change, and this is one thing we're asking companies. you have to force behaviors, and at BlackRock we are forcing behaviors. 54% of the incoming class are women. We added 4 more points in terms of diverse employment this year, and what we're doing internally is if you don't achieve these levels of impact, your compensation could be impacted. Okay,
we're doing the same thing.
And so it's just you have to force behaviors, and if you don't force behaviors, whether it's gender or race or just any way you want to say the composition of your team, you're going to be impacted, and that's not recruiting, it is development, as Ken said. And ultimately, it's still going to take time, but I am just as much shocked as Ken is that we have not seen more opportunities, and we're going to have to force change.
We're just paying attention. We are paying attention when companies like Amazon and others like them force anti-whiteness as part of DEI.
Your difference is our strength, and it is our duty to take action and make an impact. We've changed the world through our innovations, so we're approaching diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility the same way, with our full commitment. Let's use our collective power to shape a better future for our people, our customers, and the world. Because what happens out there happens to all of us. This means addressing the big issues of today and whatever comes next by constantly learning and staying curious. And that's how we'll move forward. It's how we'll attract the best talent to help them thrive. Because we'll go further when everyone is seen, heard, and valued.
And as I said with my own review of Amazon's Fallout, it would be nice to live in a world where we can assume that when a television show does have a character who is of a mixed race heritage, that it is indeed completely organic and doesn't need to be remarked on at all. Except DEI wants us to acknowledge it. People currently curating our media have long since told us they are forcing diversity, they are forcing inclusion, and they are doing woke signaling as a common practice.
This whole scene is obviously supposed to give you an idea what the retro future culture of 2077 looks like, but if a modern Marxist rewrote history and added diversity everywhere. Now, it's not like in the original Fallout games all the characters were white, but there's something uncanny about this whole thing. We'll put it at that. I'm not going to make a huge deal over it.
So a refusal to acknowledge that reality would essentially just be us lying to ourselves. But you see, we also live in some idiocracy 1984 clown world where the powers that be have compelled us to continually lie to ourselves. For far too long, we've been taught to adopt a Reddit-tier brain that both recognizes and does not recognize reality. Remember Kim Belair's talking about detokenizing minority characters? And what did I say? All this would lead to would be a Schrodinger's token minority, where you must simultaneously acknowledge diversity as something special and something to be celebrated, but also regard it as completely natural. It's just all diegetic. So yeah, just hold 2 mutually exclusive ideals in your head at the same time. I'm sure that'll work wonders for the mental health of our society.